Steeds of Mars. Case of Abraham Rockenbach, David Hurlesius, who wrote about the year 1600 and who were informed on the matter of the comets of antiquity, shows that the contents of some old manuscripts were known to the scholarly world then, though not to modern scholars. A scholar and pamphleteer, Jonathan Swift, in his Gulliver's Travels in 1726, wrote that the planet Mars had 2 satellites, very small ones. Certain astrologers have likewise discovered 2 lesser stars, or satellites, which revolve about Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of its diameters, and the outermost 5. The former revolves in the space of 10 hours, the latter in 21.5, which evidently shews them to be governed by the same law of gravitation that influences the other heavenly bodies. Actually, Mars has 2 satellites, mere rocks, one being as small as about 10 miles in diameter, the other only 5 miles. One travels around Mars in 7 hours and 39 minutes, and the other in 30 hours and 18 minutes. Their distance from the center of Mars is even less than Swift said it was. They were discovered by Asaph Hall in 1877, with the optical instruments of the days of Swift. They could not even be seen, and neither Newton nor Halley, the contemporaries of Swift, nor William Herschel in the 18th or Leverrier in the 19th century suspected their existence. It was bold of Swift to assume that their very short periods of revolution, months, measured only in hours. It was a very rare coincidence indeed. If Swift invented these satellites, guessing correctly not only on their existence, but also their number and especially their very short revolutions, this passage of Swift aroused the literary critic's wonder. It is an even chance that Swift invented the 2 satellites of Mars, and thus, by a rare accident, came close to the truth, but it may also have been that Swift had read about the Trabants in some text not known to us or to his contemporaries. The fact is that Homer knew about the 2 steeds of Mars that drew his chariot. Virgil also wrote about them. When Mars was very close to the Earth, its 2 Trabants were visible. They rushed in front of and around Mars. In the disturbances that took place, they probably snatched some of Mars' atmosphere, dispersed as it was, and appeared with gleaming manes. The steeds were yoked when Mars, Ares, prepared to descend to the Earth on a punitive expedition. When Asaph Hall discovered the satellites, he gave them the names of Phobos, Terror, and Deimos, Rout, the 2 steeds of Mars, without fully realizing what he did. He gave the satellites the same names by which they were known to the ancients. Whether or not Swift borrowed his knowledge from the existence of 2 Trabants of Mars from some ancient astrological work, the ancient poets knew of the existence of the satellites of Mars. Manuel Velacosta. The Moon and its craters. The Moon revolves around the Earth, and together with the Earth around the Sun, showing one and the same face to the inhabitants of the Earth. It can be seen in the telescope that the surface of the Moon is covered with seas of dried lava, and with great crater-like formations. Since it has no atmosphere, the contours of its surface are clearly visible, and a city or village, if it existed there, could be seen through the Palomar telescope. But it is a dead planet and very inhospitable. For a half-month, any place on it is in cold night, and for the other half in hot sunshine. There is no water on the planet, no vegetation, and probably no life at all. The ancients were interested to know whether the moon had human settlements, but moderns are concerned with the problem of the origin of the lunar craters. There are two theories. One sees in them great extinct volcanoes, the other formations produced by the bombardment of the great meteorites on the semi-liquid mass of the moon before it solidified. There are more than 30,000 such craters, small and large. Some of these circular crests rise as high as 20,000 feet above the plain. Their heat is measured by the length of their shadows. Some, like Clavius near the moon's south pole, are 150 miles in diameter. This tremendous width surpasses anything comparable among volcanoes on Earth. It is therefore questioned whether these circular mountain formations represent true volcanoes. The largest known crater produced by the impact of a body that fell on the Earth is in Arizona. It is 4/5 of a mile in diameter and much smaller than the crater formations on the moon. As is readily seen, both theories of lunar craters imply a great catastrophic occurrence. For such craters to have been formed, tremendous forces must have acted from inside or from without. If these formations were caused by impact on a viscous mass, great meteors must have come flying from many directions. Bright streaks or rays up to 10 miles wide radiate from some of the craters. Their origin, too, is not known. There are also clefts, irregular in form, about a half-mile wide and of unknown depth. In the cosmic catastrophes described in this book, the moon was repeatedly involved. Together with the terrestrial globe, it passed through the fabric of the great comet of the time of the Exodus, and in the conflicts of the 8th century before the present era. The moon was more than once displaced from its orbit by Mars. During these catastrophes, the moon's surface flowed with lava and bubbled into great circular formations, which rapidly cooled off in the long lunar night, unprotected by an atmosphere from the coolness of cosmic spaces. In these cosmic collisions, or near contacts, the surface of the moon was also marked with clefts and rifts. The play of Mars with the moon was regarded by the Greeks and the Romans as a love affair. From the Iliad we learn that Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of the moon, was warned by Jupiter Zeus not to battle Ares Mars, but to leave this task to Hera Earth and Pallas Athena, being herself predestined to the sweet work of love. Interplanetary contacts in the celestial sphere are in some respects similar to congress and germination in the biological world. In these contacts, the bodies of the planets overflow with lava, fertile ground for vegetation. And comets born of such contacts fly across the solar system and rain gases and stones and possibly also spores, germs, or larvae on planets. Thus, the notion of the ancients that love affairs were being carried on among the planetary gods and goddesses is a tale for the common people and a philosophical metaphor for the instructed. The great seas of dry lava and the great craters on the dead planet devoid of air and water bespeak the dreadful devastations, even death itself, that interplanetary contacts can leave in their wake. The great formations of craters, mountains, rifts, and plains of lava on the moon were formed not only by the upheavals described in this book, but also in those which took place in earlier times. The moon is a great unmarked cemetery flying around our Earth, a reminder of just what can happen to a planet. The planet Mars. at the present time completes one revolution around the Sun in 687 terrestrial days. Its orbit is entirely outside the Earth's orbit and is an ellipse like that of the Earth, but more stretched out so that the planet's distance from the Sun varies considerably during a revolution. When Mars and the Earth are on different sides of the Sun, the distance between them rises to over 200 million miles and may reach 248,600,000 miles from this moment on. As the distance between the two planets diminishes, Mars nightly grows more and more luminous, changing from an inconspicuous point of light to a most brilliant star, brighter than any fixed star. During a period of little more than a year, it grows 55 times brighter. Among the planets, it exceeds then even Jupiter in brilliance. The Earth and Mars approach each other every 780 days, this being the synodical period of Mars. But because of the ellipticity of the two orbits and the difference in directions in which their longer radii are turned, the closest of Mars and the Earth is not the same at every opposition. At each seventh approach, which occurs every 15 years, when Mars passes through that part of its orbit which is closest to the Sun, and the Earth simultaneously passes the segment of its orbit which is furthest from the Sun, the conjunction of two planets is especially close and is the favorable opposition. These occasions are eagerly awaited by astronomers, for no celestial body, with the exception of the Moon, is more readily observable than Mars when at favorable opposition. The distance between Mars and the Earth at the oppositions varies, from 61 million miles to 35,500,000 miles, favorable opposition. The distance at various times during the period of 15 years varies greatly, from 248,600,000 to 35,500,000 miles. Two cosmic disturbances recorded by Hebrew tradition, one on the day when Hezekiah's father Ahaz was entombed, the other when Sennacherib's army invaded Palestine, were separated by a period of 14 or 15 years. If the figure in 2 Kings 18:13 refers to an invasion which ended in the disaster, a seemingly arbitrary period of 15 years of grace, mentioned in Isaiah 38:5 and in 2 Kings 26, may also have had some relation to the periodicity of the catastrophes. The years -776, -747, -717, or -702, and -687 apparently were years of favorable opposition of Mars, when perturbations, a regular phenomenon in oppositions, reached catastrophic dimensions. If because of other reasons contact between Mars and the Earth in the past is admitted, the combined shape of the orbits, with orbits of nearest approach being reached at present every 15 years, could be regarded as a vestige of a contact or series of contacts at similar intervals in the past between the two planets, then revolving on curved orbits that were much closer to each other. Mars bears a striking resemblance to the Earth in the inclination of its axis of rotation, to the plane of its orbit, and in the period of its diurnal rotation, which to me, and many people, is very indicative of former family members, because the satellite will attune its face to the declination of its parent's axis. You will never hear that on a mainstream video about Mars and the Earth. They stay away from it. They avoid it like the plague, conceding that no conclusive data are available for the length of the day on Venus. It is possible that the axis of rotation and the velocity of rotation of Mars, stabilized and supported in their present rotation and rate by certain forces, were influenced originally by the Earth at the time of contact. Mars, being small as compared with the Earth, influenced to a lesser degree the rotation of the Earth and the position of its poles. The surface of Mars is crisscrossed with a network of canals. Their discoverer, Schiaparelli, assumed that geological forces were a factor in their formation. On the other hand, he was very careful not to combat this supposition, which includes nothing impossible, of the presence of intelligent beings on Mars who could have built these canals. Percival Lowell spent his life in a crusade to convince fellow scholars and other contemporaries that intelligent human beings live on Mars and that the canals are their work. From his observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, he believed he discovered water on Mars. He interpreted the polar caps as ice masses because of the dearth of water. The intelligent beings dug the canals to bring water to desert areas. In the early years of the 20th century, plans were devised to communicate by light signals with the hypothetical men on Mars. According to one plan, a series of light-sending stations was built into geometric figure on the plains of Siberia. The figure was to represent the Pythagorean theorem of the relation of the three sides of a right-angled triangle. If there are intelligent beings on Mars, some writers argued, they should be able to notice and interpret the signals. If they are not intelligent enough to notice the signals and understand their meaning, we should not get so eager to communicate with them. The experiment was not carried out. The contacts of Mars with other planets larger than itself and more powerful make it highly improbable that any higher forms of life, if they previously existed there, survived on Mars. It is rather a dead planet. Every higher form of life, of whatever kind it might have been, most probably had its last day. Their work could not survive either. The canals on Mars appear to be a result of the play of geological forces that answered the rifts and cracks, the outer forces acting in collisions.
The thermal balance of Mars. The equatorial diameter of Mars is about 4,200 miles. When compared with that of the Earth, the ratio in volume is 15 to 100. The ratio in mass is supposed to be 10.8 to 100. Mars is 1/6 the volume of Venus, and Venus is considered to be 7.5 times heavier than Mars. Due to the eccentricity of Mars' orbit, the isolation at aphelion is much smaller than at perihelion, the ratio being about 5 to 6. And in the southern hemisphere, the summer is much hotter, but much shorter than in the northern hemisphere. Because of the greater mean distance of Mars from the Sun, it is supposed to receive less than half the light and warmth per unit of area that the Earth receives, and for this reason its temperature must be some 65 degrees Celsius below that of the Earth, and never above freezing. The mean temperature of a year on the equatorial latitudes of Mars must be similar to that of the polar regions of the Earth. The radiometric measurement of the temperature of Mars actually shows an excess of heat. Mars emits more heat than it receives from the Sun. Does this excess of heat come from the interior of the planet? Mars is a smaller body than the Earth. It has more surface per unit of volume, and it must have cooled down quicker than the Earth, especially if it was released from the nebulous Sun by a centrifugal force before the Earth was. Kant Laplace. But also if they both originated as planets simultaneously, millions of years ago. Tidal theory. What then is the cause of the excess heat in Mars? The assumed contacts with the Earth would have caused much greater changes in and on Mars than in and on the Earth, because of the difference in mass. An interplanetary contact must have caused a conversion of motion into heat, and consequently resulted in an excess of thermal radiation over the quantity of heat brought to the planet by isolation. The contacts of Mars with Venus, and in a lesser degree with the Earth, less than 3,000 years ago, probably are responsible for the present temperature of Mars. Interplanetary electric discharges could also initiate atomic fissions with ensuing radioactivity and emission of heat.